Okay. So I have some interesting challenges today because I'm used to having a second screen and that's not happening. So since I couldn't fix that, I am looking at my notes instead of you lovely people. So my apologies. But today, my presentation is about propaganda, that it works, but can we use it for good? So I want to talk a little bit about what propaganda means, because I think it has different meanings for different people. Mostly, I want to read some excerpts from a couple of articles. One is the historical use of propaganda, some articles that give examples of modern usages and techniques, both because we might want to be on the lookout for them for ourselves, but also considering what we might use if we want to use techniques. And then I'm going to try to show a couple of short videos for examples. They're very short. They are marketing, but I'm not going to market anything nefarious. So, and I'm hoping to start a conversation about how ethics might fit into all of this about propaganda. I wanted to start out by saying that propaganda is kind of a tricky word. So, in modern usage, particularly, I think there's a hugely negative connotation. And it's something we say of our enemies, if you will, something the bad guys do, but of course we don't. Kind of like saying terrorists use torture, but good guys use enhanced interrogation techniques. And since we're the good guys and everyone always thinks they're the good guys, of course we don't use propaganda. Maybe we put our own spin on things. But of course, the word spin also has some interesting connotations. Probably we're more likely to say, hey, we're just trying to use consistent messaging, or we're using good marketing techniques. And then so I think a lot of people it's kind of hard to fathom the idea of using propaganda for good because it's kind of sneaky, it's nefarious, it's dishonest. One definition of the term, and this is from the Oxford Dictionary, is that propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. And I'm going to talk about a different definition in a moment. But for now, if we take out the misleading nature part of that definition, propaganda could be almost any communication, especially in fields like marketing, could also be, social and human services, could be any number of things, advertising, of course, politics. All of those, of course, could be misleading. They don't have to be. For political and other causes to be successful, they do need to be promoted and publicized. And really, there is almost always a bias in shared information. Sometimes it's not intentional. If it's propaganda, it's intentional, but sometimes it's not. The first article I want to just read some excerpts from is written by Dr. Nancy Snow, and she's known as Dr. Persuasion. She's written books and taught classes at several universities on media, public relations, diplomacy, and propaganda. I'm going to read an excerpt from an article she published about 10 years ago called Positive Propaganda. And I just want to warn people in advance that I will be referencing some slightly religious slogans. This is based on, by the way, a longer paper that she wrote for her class on war, media, and propaganda at Syracuse University. The sun never shined on a greater cause. Liberty, property, and no stamps. Let us consider ourselves as men, free men, Christian free men, separate from the rest of the world and bound together by the same rights, interests, and dangers. These are the times that try men's souls. These are some of the words that helped form the United States of America. The words of Thomas Paine, John Dickinson, and Samuel Adams defined the American Revolution and in many respects to this day define what it means to be an American. They are also textbook examples of propaganda. The American Revolution occurred in part because of a sustained, successful propaganda movement throughout the colonies. Starting more than a decade before the shots were first heard around the world, the propaganda movement helped fuel the fires of revolution. That might sound like somewhat of a shocking statement, given the connotations that have become associated with propaganda in modern times. To our ears and in our minds, propaganda is the ultimate in deception. It's a tool of corrupt governments seeking to deceive people, or of economic leaders looking to make a quick buck at the expense of poor workers. The word propaganda almost instantly brings to mind images of Hitler and Nazi Germany, possibly other regimes. But propaganda can be a value-free term. The American Heritage Dictionary definition of propaganda is the systemic propagation of a doctrine or cause, or of information reflecting the views and interests of those advocating such a doctrine or cause. Notice the lack of positive or negative language in that definition. Propaganda itself is not inherently negative. Certainly, it has been used for many horrific purposes throughout history. However, there are also instances in which propaganda has been used to further positive agendas. One such agenda was the American Revolution. Samuel Adams, one of the leaders of the early revolutionary movement, is considered by many historians to be a master propagandist. His writing and his skills as a political organizer helped focus colonial anger at British taxation policies into the emerging revolutionary movement. His series of 12 essays titled Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania helped spread anti-British sentiment from its center in New England and the Northeast throughout all 13 colonies. Paine's work titled Common Sense, before the Declaration of Independence, and The Rights of Man, after the war had started in earnest, remain inspirational masterpieces of patriotic propaganda. The story of the American Revolution is so often told with a sense of inevitability, that America's independence was preordained. In fact, the colony's decision to break away from the world's economic and military superpower of the era was, and even in retrospect is, a stunning decision. It's a tribute to the political writing and persuasion talent of Samuel Adams, John Dickinson, Thomas Paine, and others. It's also a reminder of the potential positive power of propaganda. So that's sort of a mostly non-political idea of the historic use, that propaganda has been around for a long, long time. And that sort of where you are in the world may determine whether you think it's positive or negative. I'm sure there are the British side of the story might not think of that as positive propaganda. I think another way that people can think of propaganda, especially in modern times, beyond politics, is going to be in advertising or marketing. So the next article I'm going to reference is an article that talks about 11 types of propaganda techniques in advertising. And of course, they're used in other things as well. I'm going to talk about the techniques just briefly. A couple of them I want to show really short videos, but just as a warning that in the video itself, we'll have to edit those out. So, but for you guys get to see them. All right, so this is the preamble of the article. I want to keep in mind that the article is, I would call fairly pro propaganda. Does not necessarily reflect my personal views, but I just want you to kind of be aware of what's out there. Things you can look for, recognize these techniques, and even when it's being used for good, it's good to keep yourself informed. What you think is good, what I think is good might be different. So if you feel like propaganda is being used on you, then you have the ability to maybe do your own research and find out, hey, is this what they're saying true? Does this reflect reality? It doesn't just show up with politicians. It doesn't just show up with ad agencies. It also shows up in things like documentaries. So it's kind of good to be aware of how these techniques are used. So what comes to mind when you think of the word propaganda? As it was mentioned earlier, you might associate with Nazis, misinformation campaigns. Because of wartime and political affiliations, propaganda is generally viewed as something inherently negative. But in the most neutral sense, it's simply a method to disseminate or promote particular ideas. If we think about it today, you'll find marketing campaigns are laden with propaganda. The question of whether we can recognize them such is a different matter. So how did marketing and advertising meet propaganda? Well, it all started in the 1920s. After World War II, Edward Bernays rebranded propaganda as public relations. He used Sigmund Freud's work, and he also worked with other psychologists on psychological motivations and transformed how advertisers sold products and services to customers. His work earned him the title Father of Modern Mass Propaganda, or the Father of Public Relations. So there's the realization that we are subject to propaganda techniques all the time. And it can seem alarming that it's coming from, branding, from companies. You may want to take comfort in knowing that propaganda can also be used for good. It all comes down to intent. So here are 11 of the most common types of propaganda in advertising. Okay, let's see if I can get this to work. So the first one is testimonial. And this form of propaganda uses well-known or credible figures to influence the target audience. They give an example in the 1980s that the Texas Department of Transportation were spending about $20 million on cleaning up litter on highways. All their previous pleas to people for keeping the streets clean showed no improvement. So they hired a local agency, Mike Blair and Tim McClure, a local ad agency, to create a campaign to turn things around. And that's how the Don't Mess with Texas campaign began. The campaign featured state heroes, and it resonated so well with target audiences that littering went down approximately 72%, which is huge, between 1987 and 1990. Now, I'm going to try to show this short video, and I'm a little challenged going between screens. Let's try rewind. Someone say yes so they can hear it in a second when it plays. Play.
Randy White and Too Tall Jones? What's a couple of football stars doing out here alongside the road?
Picking up after some folks who really don't seem to care much about Texas.
Oh, you mean the litter?
Yeah, you see the guy who threw this out the window. You tell him I got a message for him.
Don't mess with Texas?
That's the message.
I got a message for him, too.
What's that?
Well, I kind of need to see him to deliver it.
Don't mess with Texas.
We don't have to hear from them again. So that just was a short example of a commercial that was very successful. It was one of, they used other well-respected folks that were known in Texas at the time in the 70s and 80s, and it worked. So that was just an example again of testimonial. And I really quickly just need to switch back to my notes. Okay. The second type of propaganda is stereotyping, and hopefully people know what stereotyping is. Propaganda methods can highlight stereotypes and then either reinforce them or they can shatter them with the message in the advertisement. So an example I'm not going to show you guys is there's a campaign about running like a girl, and they asked people what it meant to run like a girl, and all the adults were very silly, like, or throw like a girl, and they all were like hee, and like, basically showing someone who's incompetent and not good at that thing. And then they asked young girls to run, throw, fight like a girl, and they just ran and they just threw and they just, so it was trying to highlight the idea that we've made this negative stereotype about what a girl throws like, or a girl runs like, and how it could affect the self-esteem of girls. So you actually, it's one of those things you're like, well, stereotyping is a bad thing, but it could be used to highlight how wrong it is, and then try to change the stereotype. And then next, propaganda technique is fear appeals. And it's one of the ones that I think is really effective and I found very frustrating and negative, is appealing to fear in people. And I think about it that way because I think a lot of fear appeal propaganda tends to exaggerate the thing you're supposed to be afraid of. Sometimes it just makes things up that don't really exist. And so I just find that really deceptive and horrible, and it can lead to some really horrible outcomes. So it never occurred to me, somehow I just didn't think about it, but fear appeals, they are very effective and they can be used for good, if you will. So I'm going to try again to show another short video. This one doesn't actually have much sound, so if we don't get sound, it's okay, but I will try to get us some sound. Let's see, share screen. Okay, this one. I'm sorry, the music might have been a little loud on that. I wanted you to hear the music. I think the music, just like in movies and TV shows and other things, it is a way to connect people emotionally with what's happening. And I think they did a really amazing job with connecting those emotions of, it's all well and good to tell someone you should wear a seatbelt to protect yourself and so on, but to show a family and a family seeing each other and what would happen if that father, assumably, didn't have the seatbelt, what that person would be losing. This is incredibly effective propaganda that's fear-based, right? But is actually intended to help people promote safety. So that was just an incredibly powerful. I was like, no, there's part of me that's really, again, that negative connotation with propaganda. I was like, fear-based propaganda, that's, never a good thing. And then I saw the video and it's like, wow, okay, I get that now. I can see how that might be helpful. So that one again was fear appeals. Bandwagon. People are probably familiar with bandwagon. So it creates a sense of isolation, triggers FOMO, fear of missing out, in specific people who long to be part of some desirable group. And I think this happens a lot with advertising. They use an example of the Fire Festival, which some people may have heard about. They used a lot of this. So Billy McFarland did a supposedly very exclusive music lifestyle festival on an island. And he got celebrities like Kendall Jenner and Bella Hadid and Haley Baldwin to promote the event. The thing is, the campaign was actually hugely successful. The article says, although marketed as an exclusive extravaganza, it ended up being a complete farce. That's true. But it wasn't the fault of the propaganda. It was the fault of the people managing the festival. They did not know what they were doing. And I there's a couple of great documentaries about the Fire Festival. And I just think the person in charge was a psychopath, but a grifter for sure. So the marketing worked, the festival didn't. So propaganda still can work for a cause that is not viable. Fifth type or technique is plain folks. So sometimes seeing seeming instead of the bandwagon one, we're like, this famous person does it or is going to do it, so I should do it. The plain folk one is regular people are endorsing a product or a service because it primes people to try it out. They say, hey, it might fit into my life because it fits into this everyday person's life too. And so that's the basic idea behind plain folk propaganda. Now that can backfire too. So for instance, Nutella apparently had a commercial where they were showing Nutella as like an everyday breakfast food, and you could put it on any bread thing, and how wholesome and wonderful that was. The brand was later sued for marketing itself as a breakfast food because the article is saying it's dessert in a jar, really. Like, is this a good idea? But that was the idea behind that technique. Transfer propaganda is really interesting to me. So transfer propaganda, the agenda behind this tactic is to rationally tie an audience's positive associations to a completely unrelated concept, or in some cases, negative associations. Transfer propaganda relies on symbolism to push its target audience to make illogical connections. Edward Bernays used this in the Torches of Freedom campaign from the 1920s. So, in the 1920s, men were heavily advertised toward smoking, but they were trying to advertise toward women, but there was a general belief in the populace that it was unladylike to smoke. So I'm going to try to show this video. I'm a little worried about the volume. I'm going to see if I can work on that. But it actually has Edward Bernays in it, where he talks about this campaign. And let's see if I can get this going. This is called "He Said Cigarettes to Women Are Torches of Freedom." Oh.
Even George Washington Hill, the advertising genius who made Lucky Strikes America's best-selling cigarettes, couldn't figure out how to break through the social barriers that kept women from smoking. So he turned to a public relations genius, Edward Bernays.
He said, we have a problem. We're losing half the market in America because there is a taboo against women smoking, particularly smoking in the streets. He said, I want your help on that. So I said, before I can offer you a suggestion or a recommendation, I would like your authority to visit Dr. A.A. Brill, who was the leading psychoanalyst of his time. So I went to Dr. Brill and I said, can you tell me what cigarettes mean to women? And as quick as that, he said, cigarettes to women are torches of freedom that they use to dramatize their objection to the taboo against smoking by men. And then he added as an afterthought, and they titillate the erogenous zones of the lips. So I left and wondered what to do with that information. And I decided we would get debutantes to light torches of freedom in the Easter parade to protest man's inhumanity to women by the taboo against smoking. Within 6 weeks, smoking became an accepted pattern for women throughout the United States.
An ancient prejudice has been removed. Today, legally, politically, and socially, womanhood stands in her true light. American intelligence has cast aside the ancient prejudice that held her to be inferior.
While disappointed.
Yeah, so that one's a little upsetting, I think. But it's that idea that you're associating smoking with freedom and being treated humanely, and it was extraordinarily effective to basically highlight that false relationship, and so that worked for that reason. So I don't like that they use it that way. I just wanted to say it's a way that it can be used, but it could also be used in positive ways. So the last couple are, we're probably familiar with name calling. So number 7 is name calling propaganda, and it's based on putting the other party down. Employing this technique in advertising normally starts brand wars. So I know Wendy's does a lot of this. I think Burger King has done it with McDonald's. Employing, it can be lighthearted, but sometimes the animosity can get intense. I'm not showing a Burger King commercial, sorry. Card stacking. This is interesting. This is number 8. So this, it presents selective information to paint an incomplete and incorrect narrative to influence people. And I think this is where I start having concerns about that misleading part of it. So companies that partake in greenwashing use this tactic. H&M is criticized for it. So greenwashing is where a company that causes a lot of like carbon emissions, or in this case, H&M, it's clothing waste, both in producing clothing and because they also produce large quantities of low quality clothing. And so a lot of people throw it out after not much use. So basically they were trying to hype themselves as, hey, we're going to use this recycled material in some of our clothing to be more green. And critics were saying, hey, if you didn't produce so much low quality clothing in the first place, contributing to the greenhouse gases and the clothing waste, maybe you wouldn't need to do it the green materials in the first place. So it's sort of like, hey, you're telling us I'm doing a good thing when in the background, you're actually making things worse. That's card stacking. Glittering generalities. I think when I had a professor call this puffery. Glittering generalities employs loaded words and strong slogans to leave an impact on the audience receiving the message. In marketing, this plays a big role in brand positioning. So prestigious car brands like Jaguar and Mercedes-Benz use this tactic, and lots of companies will just try to put themselves like way up on a pedestal. And that's going to be the glittering generalities propaganda. Number 10 is ad nauseum propaganda. It's the power of repetition. And I think this can be very, very, very effective. it campaigns target audiences at a very high frequency to remain top of mind. So just commercials that play a lot. Sometimes it's slogans that are repeated a lot. I watched a video recently where there was a doctor talking about what was happening in ERs with COVID. And we know that the pandemic can be kind of complex and people struggle with the idea of wearing masks, and we try to explain things and the facts kind of get ignored. What I noticed about this particular video was the doctor would explain what he was dealing with on a day-to-day basis in very simple language. And then he said, wear a mask. And then he explained a little bit more about the number of patients he saw die and the families that couldn't see their family member, loved one again. And then he said, wear a mask. And then he gave a little more information about the number of his colleagues that had passed away and how many people were burnt out. And he said again, wear a mask. Very simply, just repeating this simple message over and over and over again, to me, was very effective. And then the last one that this particular article talks about is appeal to prejudice. Again, another one that's upsetting to me. So it exploits prejudices for the propagandist benefit. They talk about fairness creams, ads for lightening creams for the skin. And I don't want to go into detail, but most people kind of have an idea about appeals to prejudice. So those are just 11 of common propaganda techniques that can be used in advertising, in politics, in movie making, all those kinds of things. The end of this particular article, they say, as a marketer, understand these techniques and tactics can help you launch transformative campaigns, but we hope you'll use your new insight with consideration and care. So I guess it's like, do good with your superpowers, something like that. I realize there's so much to talk about on this, and I don't want to, I'm at a half an hour now, so I'm going to wrap up. I wanted to briefly mention, I was talking to a colleague that teaches at another college about healthcare, and she talked about social inoculation theory. So the idea that you present ideas to people about healthcare in advance of things they may encounter in the wild. So you might say to a kid who could face peer pressure, hey, you may run into somebody who's going to tell you that, cigarettes aren't all that harmful. And actually then give information about what can happen when you smoke. And there are some studies that say that this kind of what they call social inoculation, resistance to influence, can be effective if it's done well. So I meant to talk about them more, and I realize I'm running out of time. So my apologies. Just some final thoughts that I had. I suggested the topic because I wanted an answer to the question if propaganda could be used for good. At the time, I think I was feeling pretty cynical in the face of political propaganda. And I felt like only the bad guys were using it, and or at least using it effectively. And that's just my take. And I know not politics, I just say in general, it was something I've been worried about. So I've just wondered if it was ethical to use it, or even if in promotion of good causes. So I think about challenges and issues. A lot of the stuff that I try to promote or think about in the world are complex. And I think that the challenge can be that propaganda works best when it doesn't have to be explained. So coming up with that really resonating message and being honest is really challenging. It's easier to get a message across by leaving out the messy parts. I get troubled by generalities and lies of omission. So I think and I also think when there's not like a big organization or company, political forces, big money involved, it's hard to have consistent, easily understood messaging. Like you don't have that big think tank going on. Even when there is money involved, you can have really bad missteps. Like, I don't know if people have heard about South Dakota's campaign, meth, we're on it. The slogan was meth, we're on it. Of course, it meant that they were on top of the problem of meth, not meth itself, but the slogan that they came up with was pretty terrible. I think that the t-shirt sold out though. So basically that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. Oh, and I was hoping, again, mainly to start a conversation about propaganda, thinking about what you're seeing in marketing and politics and things every day. And maybe, is there a way that we can use these tools effectively for good, to promote good causes, to make the world a better place, instead of selling cigarettes to debutantes. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Can we give, please turn off your mute, and let's give an applause to